Hello, everyone. I am Shazmin, your MC for today. So thank you all for joining us in today's dialogue on China-US, Destined for War, Inevitable Peace. The forum is organized by World Scientific Publishing. Now moving on to the next slide. Now for a few housekeeping notes before we start. So you are most welcome to leave your camera on, but please keep the mics muted whilst the forum is ongoing. There will also be a Q&A session after the talk, so please feel free to post your questions to any of the special guests in the chat at any time. After posting your questions in the chat, you may be invited to unmute and read it out during the Q&A session if you are comfortable doing so. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted online. Moving on to the next slide. So today we are honored.
Jasmine, please let everyone in the waiting room.
Yes.
There's a lot of people there.
Yeah, of course. Okay. So today we are honored to welcome Norman Pearlstine and Victor Gao as our special guests, both of whom bring unparalleled expertise to the discussion on US-China relations. Today's discussion will be centered on the heightened tension between the United States and China amidst current rhetoric suggesting the intractability of US-China relations. Our special guests will explore ways to maintain and improve these relations through cooperative efforts. They will analyze potential strategies for reducing confrontation and fostering a more constructive dialogues between the two nations. Moving on to the next slide. Now to introduce our first special guest. Norman Pearlstine was top editor of the Wall Street Journal, Time Incorporated, and Los Angeles Times, and held leadership positions at Bloomberg and Forbes. Earlier, he was the WSJ's North Asia Bureau Chief, the Asian Wall Street Journal's first managing editor, served on the Far Eastern Economic Review Board, and was responsible for Asia Week. Norman Pearlstine serves on the board of Blue Ocean, a special purpose acquisition company with interests in Tokyo and Taipei, and on the boards of 4 nonprofits that supports journalism and journalists. He is also working on a book about the American and Pacific centuries. Now moving on to the next slide. Our next special guest is Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, the leading independent global think tank in China, Chairman of China Energy Security Institute, Chair Professor of Soochow University, Chairman of Abor Group of Hong Kong, a member of the Beijing Energy Club, a member of the International Advisory Board of the Energy Intelligence Group in London, an advisor to Saudi Aramco, and a member of the editorial board of the OPEC Energy Review. Now we are also pleased to welcome back our familiar panel of experienced co-moderators. Moving on to the next slide. The first is, please can you go back to the previous slide? Okay, moving on to the next slide. So first to join us is Professor Jichun Chu, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Bucknell University, USA. He is also a member of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, as well as an accomplished author and editor. And then next is Professor Daxuan Feng, Honorary Dean of Henan University Belt and Road Research Institute, and the Chief Advisor of China Silk Road I Valley Research Institute. Now, without further ado, let us welcome Norman Pearlstine to kick off the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. I think it is a daunting task to speak to such a knowledgeable group about U.S.-China relations, and I hope that some of these observations will be at least provocative and lead to a healthy discussion, even if it's unclear how much of what I am saying will be new to all of you. I do think that it is important to understand some of the fundamental differences in outlook between the U.S. and China and the ways in which we can easily get in trouble by misunderstanding or misappropriating ideas. it, I think, is very important to take a look at where we are and ask the question whether we are entering a Pacific or an Asian century. And the principal difference between the two really revolves around the involvement of the United States and whether it can legitimately call itself a Pacific power, and whether it can also assert that it is an Asian power. I think that um, as the American century is drawing to a close, it is clear that China seeks to surpass the US, repudiating democracy, capitalism, rule of law, and a critical role of a free press bent on questioning its authoritarian dogma and doctrines. And even though wars in the Mideast and Ukraine are preoccupying a lot of Americans in this election year, responding to China's challenge will be America's top international priority for decades to come. And while the US and China may seek predominance in the Pacific century, neither will prevail without the support from the rest of Asia. Japan, South Korea, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam will all have large economies and complicated relationships with China and the US. My feeling is that while many of China's neighbors oppose its territorial desires, authoritarian model, military spending, support for North Korea, they may still distance themselves from the US if we are unable or unwilling to live up to our own ideals and commitments. I think it's noteworthy that so many Asian countries, for example, refused to go along with the sanctions that America imposed on Russia after it attacked Ukraine. The fact that several Asian and South Asian countries, including India, have remained neutral or have opposed only limited sanctions is important to keep in mind. I think it's also important to recognize America's long ambivalence about its role as a Pacific power, despite granting statehood to California in 1850 and purchasing Alaska from Russia in 1857. It's largely ignored the region for many years, and Hawaii and Alaska didn't gain statehood until 1959. World War II, Korea and Vietnam Wars confirmed America's importance to Asia, and in their aftermath, Japan and South Korea have certainly tried to pattern their legal system more on that of the US than of any other country. I think it's also important that for all of the concern that the collapse of South Vietnam would lead to a so-called domino theory where the rest of Southeast Asia would also be more supportive of North Vietnam, that has not really happened, and Vietnam has emerged as an entrepreneurial power, defying a lot of those expectations. It's the American century itself was really a fabrication that actually was put together by Henry Luce, the founder and owner of Time. I managed to grow up thinking I didn't have much in common with him, but after serving as editor-in-chief of Time Inc. and sitting in his desk for many years, I tried to come to understand what it was that he was proposing when he defined the American century. And while much of it was about wanting to support Britain in the war against Germany, it clearly had implications for Asia as well. Luce published his essay, The American Century, in 1941, and that was a year before I was born, and I found myself living under that umbrella for most of my life. He was the son of missionaries and was born in China. He believed journalism had a broader purpose to introduce America, its commerce and culture, to the rest of the world, especially to China. And he really was very instrumental in the post-war period in lining up American support for the Republic of China, based in Taiwan, and for it being perceived as China's legitimate government. The U.S. didn't recognize, well, the PRC until 1979. Kissinger's visit to China in 1971, followed by Nixon's visit, certainly changed the relationship, led to China's joining the United Nations, replacing Taiwan, and yet a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today, and especially China's assertion of one China that includes Taiwan, actually began, I think, with U.S. support for the Republic of China following World War II, and that I think that has really undermined any position we might have that would suggest Taiwan is anything other than a part of China. I think that while China may be challenging America in Asia, the bigger challenge in a way is an internal one, where both from the left and from the right, a coalition has emerged in the United States that threatens our own ideals. Rupert Murdoch's amorality has supplanted Luce's morality. Isolationists and opportunists masquerading as diplomats are playing an increasingly large domestic role in this election. And I think at this point that while we have military treaties with the Philippines and with Japan, that there would not be strong support within the U.S. To go to war to defend Taiwan should China decide that it wants to control it by force. But I think our own policies are so inconsistent and our leadership is so inconsistent that it makes it very difficult for the rest of Asia to depend on us. One of the signature accomplishments of Barack Obama's presidency was the creation of TPP, and Donald Trump abrogated it during his first month in office. And I think that kind of inconsistent behavior from such a large, important player as the U.S. is as much of a threat to U.S.-China relations as anything that China itself may do. I do think that we need to recognize that Xi Jinping is providing a different kind of leadership than his three predecessors, and this is partly a function of increased spending on nuclear weapons and on the Chinese military, and also from a very strong recognition that China must be independent from the large European and American powers that in many ways dominated it for years. So with that kind of background, I think this current election will have a huge impact on the future of U.S. relations with China and with the rest of Asia. The rare bipartisan consensus that has emerged against China is in many ways disturbing to me. I think a lot of it grew out of concerns about Huawei and whether it was a threat to national security, a threat to technological leadership, or just a threat to trade. And I think the truth is that it is all three, and that by putting tariffs in front of China, by putting restrictions on U.S. technology and exporting to China, all that we have done is accelerated China's own sense of independence and its ability really to learn to operate without the kinds of restrictions that we are imposing on it. One of the good things that has grown out of spending time with Daswan and other Chinese American academics is seeing some of their work. And I would just conclude with the recent piece that Joel Wong has publicized that relies on the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which has concluded that China has surged ahead in the global race for technological leadership, dominating research in 37 out of 44 critical technologies tracked by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And if you told that to most Americans, they would have trouble believing you. But I think it recognizes why we need to do everything we can to learn to work with and live with China without really trying to in any way decide what its legal system will be or how we can react to it. Thank you.
Now we are honored to welcome back our other special guest, Victor Gao.
Thank you very much. This is Victor Gao attending from Beijing. I'm very honored to attend by my time tonight's important webinar. And I want to talk about 5 points. Hopefully we can leave more time for dynamic exchange after the two speakers. The first point is why I believe the destined for war theory, at least applied to China and the United States, is a fallacy. The second point is my analysis of what I understand are the real nightmares of Washington as far as China is concerned. The third point is what I coined as Tonya Harding syndrome, which is the best I can come up with to try to understand what Washington is doing against China. Now, the fourth point is what I understand to be China's position vis-a-vis the United States, namely your God for you and my God for me. Now, the final point, the fifth point, is what I want to focus upon. That is the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. So come back to the first point. We know there is a very distinguished professor at Harvard, whom I highly respect and very much admire, who came up with a book called Destined for War, coming up with a theory called the Thucydides trap. Now, whether he intends it or not, I do not know. But it's very apparent that many decision makers in the United States, in the military, in the security, in the government, in Congress, you name it, and also many in the academic, really took at least the name of his book as it is and believe, rightly or wrongly, that China and the United States are destined for war. I think, with due respect to Professor Graham Addison, whom I highly respect, I think, at least for that theory as applied to China and the United States, there is a major flaw. And leading me to believe that this theory applied to China and the United States is a fallacy. Why? Because all the cases of war, Professor Graham Addison very scholarly analyzed in the book, involve conventional wars. And China and the United States today are not only major conventional weapon powers, but also, more importantly, nuclear weapon powers. Therefore, you simply cannot apply whatever conclusion you come up with, regardless of how much scholastic work you have done in coming up with that theory, to nuclear powers as China and the United States. Because I think the fact that both China and the United States are major nuclear weapon countries completely made the conclusion arrived at in that book, Destined for War, irrelevant as far as China and the United States is concerned. Why? Because we know on September the 25th, China launched an ICBM testing covering a total distance of 12,000 kilometers, launched from China's Hainan Island and landing, I understand, to the east of the French Polynesia in South Pacific. Now, the real distance it could travel is more than 14,000 kilometers, and China has actually more lethal weapons than that, meaning for this particular ICBM, China can cover the totality of anywhere in North America, the totality of Eurasian continent, most of the African continent, and the Latin American continent. And with more lethal versions of these missiles and other ICBMs, China can cover the totality of the whole world. And the speed it traveled at is supersonic. Nothing can stop it. Nothing can intercept that. Meaning, if there is a war between China and the United States, I'm afraid no country can come up with a net winner. Both will be destroyed. And that means you are talking about Armageddon. So I hope decision makers in the government, in the parliament, or in the military, in the security sectors, etc., would really need to think about the profound consequences if a war really breaks out. And it will give all of us incentive to make sure that neither China nor the United States would ever think about using war as a means to solve whatever problems there are between China and the United States. Therefore, whether you agree with me or not, please just listen to what I have to say. The Destined for War theory, or the Thucydides trap, as applied to China and the United States, in Victor Gao's best judgment, is a fallacy. It should not be a policy goal for anyone to pursue. And if you pursue that goal, you will lead the world to Armageddon. Now, the second point is what I understand are the real nightmares of Washington vis-a-vis China. I think Washington has suffered and is suffering from two nightmares. One is that Washington calls China now a pacing threat, and it says Russia is not a threat by any measurement, real measurement, and China is a pacing threat. And they worry about China catching up or surpassing the size of the US economy anytime soon. And then related to the first nightmare, they suffer more profoundly from the second nightmare. That is their belief that if China catches up or surpasses that of the United States in terms of the size of the economy, China may impose its version of the truth, its political system, its way of life, its values onto the United States, or pushing the United States away from the center of the world, or even relegating the United States to a second tier, if not a third tier country in the future. I would say the first nightmare, that is worrying about China gaining more strength and the size of the Chinese economy eventually catching up or even surpassing that of the United States, should not be a nightmare because it's a megatrend in the world of today. China is already larger than the United States as the size of the economy. If we use purchasing power parity as the measurement, it's next to the United States if we use official exchange rate. But if you look at the output of China's manufacturing sector, it's larger than not only that of the United States, but the next 8 or 9 countries, largest manufacturing countries combined together. If you look at many, many things, and we do have a list, it covers almost 300 major items. China is not only the largest producer in the world, China's production normally would account for more than 50% of the global production. So when you talk about so many things, you think, okay, China is either next to the United States or already ahead of the United States. And if you listen very carefully to what Elon Musk has to say, he keeps saying that by the middle of this century, the size of the Chinese economy will be doubling that of the United States. And I don't think Elon Musk has really missed a major point for all these years of his active career. Now, from the Chinese perspective, they firmly believe that no country in the world has any legitimate right to deprive the Chinese people of their legitimate right of economic development in peace. But no one in China, as far as I know, and I'm deeply rooted here, has any desire or dream or ambition or plan to impose China's political system or ideology or values onto the United States or any other country. Because from the Chinese perspective, all countries in the world, you have about 200 of them altogether, 193 members of the United Nations, we believe everyone is equal. There should be no discrimination against the larger countries or smaller countries, and no one should have any expectation to impose its own values or political system onto the other country. Now, that leads me to the third point. Why should the US government or Washington, figuratively speaking, try to suffer from these two nightmares, and what they want to do to stop China's rise or China's imposition of its own values and political system or ideology onto the United States? Now, you can look at this question from many other perspectives, but I came up with my own definition. It's called a Tonya Harding syndrome. You know, Tonya Harding was a national champion of figure skating back in the early 1990s. Then she worried about Nancy Kerrigan, a younger, prettier, more handsome competitor, and eventually her associates, including her husband, came up with a scheme to whack the kneecap of Nancy Kerrigan, putting her out of competition. But eventually, when the dust settled, Tonya Harding was banned for life from figure skating competition at all. Now, I think Washington is suffering from this Tonya Harding syndrome. It wants to whack China's kneecap to put China out of competition, if you use that, or basically just doing normal businesses. And this leads to the most recent example of literally completely banning anything China has to do with the EV car. Not only EV cars already assembled ready to use, but also the hardware and the software connected with anything on the highways in the United States. Literally, it is a 100% total ban of anything, everything that China has to do with EV cars, either the wholly assembled car or any related hardware or software. Now, you hear a lot of these horrible stories. You heard about the kind of outlawing ZTE and then try to kill Huawei and then try to kill Dajiang and then try to put TikTok, for example, out of competition or out of operations in the United States. You come up with so many horror stories. And I would say, if you really have the decency of mind and analyze what Washington is doing, literally, they are turning free trade, market economy principles upside down on their head. It is not the best of the United States. It's not the staunchly defending free trade and market economy, for example. It is basically using tariffs or other protectionist, isolationist measures to block out China. Now, if you look at EV in particular, I would say don't turn the US automobile industry into another version of Kodak, because the EV is the mega trend, and China does lead the world in many ways of the EV, and China has a complete ecosystem for the EV production and R&D and materials. But it is the right time for countries like the United States and major automobile making countries in Europe to cooperate with China so that you get the benefit of this EV revolution, rather than try to shut down China, shut out of China, because that's not the right way to protect the automobile industry in the United States. Because if you try to protect the traditional fuel car automobile industry as it is, rather than try to accelerate your work and make that leap of faith from fuel car into EV car, what you are doing is what exactly Kodak did to ignore the digital camera technologies, and eventually they are buried in the bankruptcy. So I would say the best way to make sure that the automobile industry in the United States is truly sustainable is to make that leap of faith, to embrace EV revolution. And if you really want to embrace EV revolution, China can be turned into the best partner that the United States can work with, rather than a country whose products you need to completely outlaw from China. So please remember this Tonya Harding syndrome, and I hope if you really understand what I mean, you probably will better understand what Washington is trying to do with regard to so many things. And they forget to ask one question, which is very crucial. Why China, in the past 10 years or so, is coming up with more and more technological breakthroughs? Why? Nobody in Washington is asking that crucial question. Let me tell you what I understand. I think true technological breakthroughs need to be based on several things. One is the rapid economy development. Second, the size of the economy development, the pool of talents, and then the pool of financial resources. I would say for China, based on what they have achieved since 1978, for the past 46 years or so, China has achieved all these critical components and ingredients upon which they are well positioned to achieve the next wave of technological breakthroughs. So don't believe that if you whack one or several kneecaps in China, you can stop this peaceful rise of China. You cannot. There are 1.4 billion people in China, meaning 1.4 pairs of kneecaps for you to whack. And if you believe by keep whacking the Chinese kneecap, you can stop China's development or continued economic and technological breakthrough, I think it may be truly a fantasy. Now, that leaves me to another very important point. So what is China's view on this one? China looks at the United States a very important country, because if you really look at China and the United States in terms of economic development, so many other things, etc., these two countries are very much intertwined. For many years, the United States was the largest trading partner of China. Now it's the third after ASEAN as a whole and EU as a whole. I hope the United States will bounce back to be number one trading partner with China. But from the Chinese perspective, China really highly respects the United States, and no one in China really wants to challenge the position of the United States. And China, philosophically speaking, views the United States together with all the other, about 200 other countries, on an equal footing. And what we believe is the right thing is your God for you and my God for me. I respect your God. I respect your right to worship your God, but you need to respect my right to worship my God. My pathway is only unique for China, and your pathway, whether it works or not, is purely the business of the American people. So you should not even think about imposing your way of life or your way of doing things onto China. And I will never impose my views, my ideologies, my political system onto the United States. Therefore, I would call on both Beijing and Washington to really make that crucial decision to talk about what matters most, how China and the United States can bridge their gap and really come to terms with the fact that we need to live with each other, we need to get along with each other, and we need to respect each other. And if you believe that the world to have China-US cooperation will not be a better world than today's world, I will beg to disagree. I think the world when China and the United States can really get along with each other and cooperate rather than viciously whacking each other's kneecap will be a better world. And that will leave our children's generation and their children's generation and many, many other generations to come in greater peace and stability. Now, this leads me to my final point, which I came up with after really thinking very carefully about what Professor Graham Allison has wrote about the Destined for War. My conclusion, which is a refute of this fallacy applied to China and the United States, is the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Now, you know, people in the United States normally would say there are two things inevitable. Death is inevitable. Probably Elon Musk think he can cheat death. And the other thing is paying tax to Uncle Sam and to your state government. If you do not pay tax, the law arms or the rule of law will get you. So these are the traditional two inevitabilities for the American people. I've added a third one. That is the inevitability of peace. Why? Because China and the United States, even though very much intertwined with each other, are very, very different countries. I spent 4 years in New Haven at Yale, and I try my best to understand the United States in terms of the constitutional law, political system, you name it, and many other things, and arms control, for example. And my conclusion is that China and the United States are very, very different. But no one can succeed if he wants to turn China into another United States or turn the United States into another China. We are very different. We have completely different background, historical legacies, for example, geopolitical positions, you name it, so many, many things. Natural endowment. The United States is probably one of the best naturally endowed countries in the world, whereas China's natural endowment in terms of, for example, resources, you name it, are not that well positioned compared with that of the United States. However, I firmly believe that China and the United States cannot afford to have a war against each other. If anyone believes that the war, if ever breaking out between China and the United States, will be very much contained or restricted to the conventional war realm, I think that will be a completely wrong and misguided conclusion. It will not. I think if war really breaks out involving anything between China and the United States, it most likely will escalate very fast and eventually the two countries will stare at each other's eye, and they will be on the brink of Armageddon. Therefore, war is not and should not be an option between China and the United States. So what to do with all these differences, sometimes problems, challenges, crises, for example, misjudgments between China and the United States. I think whatever there are between China and the United States, there is only one way to deal with them. That is through peace. That is diplomacy, real diplomacy, and negotiations, sometimes public, sometimes behind the scene, top confidential, for example. But anyway, we have to adopt a new paradigm in dealing with these difficulties and challenges between China and the United States. That leads me to my firm conviction that despite of the fact that China and the United States do not get along, at least right now, and there are so many things they like or dislike in each other, for example, we need to get along eventually. The sooner, the better. Philosophically speaking, I'm firmly convinced that despite of our dislikes, despite of all our problems, there is inevitability of peace between China and the United States. And the sooner we reach that conclusion, the better. And even though the next presidency of the United States from 2025 to 2029, whether Trump or Harris, may not come to terms with this inevitability of peace between China and the United States, I do believe, as an optimist in heart, that eventually our two great nations will need to come to that term, that is inevitability of peace between China and the United States. And I hope you will at least listen to me and try to understand what I mean. And if you are convinced by any way, I will be very happy, because I want to rally everyone I know to promote my theory of the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'll be happy to answer your questions together with the previous speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman and Victor, for the insightful presentations. We have now come to the discussion between the special guests and the co-moderators.
Thank you, Jasmine. First of all, I want to thank both Victor and Norm for their entertaining and insightful and also really thought-provoking comments. And I guess instead of commenting on such wonderful remarks, I guess I will raise a couple of questions for both of you. I'll go to Norm first. Norm, you provided really a panoramic and historical review of the U.S.-China relationship. I think you mentioned Henry Luce. I think Henry Luce, I believe, still highly respected on both sides. And Norm, you yourself has engaged in media and journalism for decades. When you say that Henry Luce himself, reporting from China, trying to educate Americans about China, I was deeply moved, really. So I just wonder, in your view, do you think American or Western media in general, and American journalists in particular, do you think they are doing the same thing? Do you think they are contributing to educating Americans about what's going on in China? What should we do about the U.S.-China relationship? Or do you think they are actually adding fuel to the fire and contributing to the deterioration of the relationship? So what is the role of media today, in your view? That's my first question for you, Norm. My second question is about, so because you also touch upon the Taiwan issue. Obviously, we all understand this is the most difficult and most sensitive issue between the two sides. I think you mentioned that apparently there's some inconsistency, among different administrations. So I just wonder, based on your experience, what do you think is the America's end goal regarding Taiwan? I mean, officially, the United States has this one China policy. they make a clear distinction from China's one China principle. I think they're kind of playing with words here a little bit. But a long-standing policy of the United States is that we do not support Taiwan independence, and we have this one China policy. But do you think the United States is actually moving from one China policy to one China, one Taiwan policy? So I just want to know exactly what is your view of America's end goal on Taiwan. Coming to Victor Gao, Victor, I have higher respect and admiration of you and what you said. I think the 5 points you made are very clear, and I think your arguments are very convincing. It is really difficult to disagree with you, really, right? Yeah. But I want to make some very brief comments, then maybe also ask you a couple of questions. First point, you mentioned this fallacy of destined for war through Thucydides' trap. I guess, for Allison's defense, the book is titled Destined for War. Then the subtitle is Can America and China Escape Through Thucydides' Trap? Question mark. So I don't think he's advocating a war, or I don't think he thinks that the war is inevitable. So he raised that issue as a question, and I understand that actually he's welcomed in China. He even has met with Xi Jinping. Apparently, he's raising the awareness of this issue is really helpful to all of us to understand this problem. So I don't think we should read too much into this theory. I don't think he's advocating war, or he's that pessimistic, right? However, on the other hand, and I also want to mention that in international relations, there's a school of thought called power transition, right? And actually, I belong to that school. Scholars in the power transition school actually don't take that theory, don't take that concept called Thucydides' trap very seriously. Why? Because we think that it's a copy, it's a replicate of the power transition theory. And Professor Allison actually has not done a great job in acknowledging that this idea is basically comes from the power transition theory. So actually, maybe I'm saying too much about this. Actually, a group of IR scholars in the power transition theory don't like him, for the fact that he has not cited much work from the power transition theory. And those of you who know the theory of power transition, this goes back to at least 1958 when A.K. Organsky actually first proposed the theory of power transition. And later on, generations of power transition scholars have tried to figure out, what are the causes of war and what are the conditions for peace. So those are the issues scholars of power transition, including myself, actually have studied. And my first book actually is about applying power transition theory to the U.S.-China relationship, and it was published in 2005, about 10 years before Professor Allison actually, when he coined this term, Thucydides' trap. So again, we don't want to read too much into this. The Harding Harding syndrome. I totally agree with you, Victor. I can't help but saying that great men think alike. Because why? Because a few years ago, actually, I wrote an opinion piece for The Hill in Washington D.C., exactly talking about the same thing. The title of my opinion piece is "The Harding Way or the Harder Way." And I argue that right now the United States is apparently adopting the Harding way, but I think that the United States actually should adopt a different way, meaning the harder way, working harder to compete with your rivals, especially China, not following the Harding principle, Harding practice. Try to kick and trip your rival and to stay ahead. It's not sportsmanship. That's not good, right? Yeah. So I just want to make that brief comment. Now the question for Victor. I think one of the issues between the United States and China is that the public opinions on both sides have turned very ugly, very negative towards each other, right? And the United States, according to all these opinion polls, positive views of China have sharply declined. in the past few years, especially, right? I think probably they have reached the lowest in history, actually, right? And I just wonder, what can China do, perhaps, to help reverse the trend? Maybe it's too late, because the negative view of China is as high as like 90%, right? So is there anything China can do to arrest this further decline of negative perception of China? Maybe not a complete turnaround, but at least maybe so that more Americans will view China more favorably. That's question number one, right? Number two, I totally agree with your theory of inevitability of peace. I mean, it's unimaginable that, right, two nuclear powers will fight, and that's really, as you said, Armageddon, right? And we want to avoid that. So I think, in principle, I don't think anybody would disagree with that, including hawks in Washington, D.C., right? I think they would also agree that, yes, we need peace. We need to avoid conflict. But do we have any suggestions for both sides? What baby steps can be taken on both sides to actually avoid war and build or rebuild confidence and trust, and eventually, adopt policies that will lead to peace instead of to conflict. So those are my initial questions and simple comments. So hopefully makes sense to you. And I'm not sure whether Professor Feng has further questions, or two speakers should respond to them first. Professor Feng, do you have?
Let them respond first.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it's you've raised many more issues than I think I can possibly respond intelligently to in a short period of time. But I would say that the first thing that America has to do before it can be either an effective partner or adversary to China is to get its own house in order. And failing that, it will be very difficult to develop a constructive relationship with China, or for that matter, with many other countries. And so when you think about American policy today, the desire, for instance, to lump China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea as some kind of axis of chaos, in a way does a real disservice in that it fails to appreciate China's needs for natural resources, for example. It fails to appreciate the ways in which we have used the power of the dollar and the supremacy of the U.S. economy for many years, to try to force or impose our policies on other countries. And I think the hardest thing for the United States to recognize is that under any scenario, over the next 20 to 30 years, it will not just be China that will be in competition with the United States, but many other countries as well. India, obviously, but even a country like Indonesia, in terms of GDP, could be a formidable competitor. And my big concern really about the US is that there's not the kind of leadership in place to even be thinking about these kinds of issues. The the support for massive tariff, for example, is, I just think, the fastest way to strengthen China and its relationship with the rest of the world. So I'm quite pessimistic about our ability to do much constructive with China until we really have consistent leadership within the United States. And if anything, I think this current election is taking us in an opposite direction.
Thank you, Norm. Yeah, thank you very much. So, Victor, please.
Thank you. You are raising very important, very interesting questions. Let me give a best shot at that. First of all, I would urge that China and the United States would agree to organize members of Congress in Washington to periodically visit China in a mutually arranged way, so that the members of Congress, both the Republicans and the Democrats, can really see with their own eyes what's going on in China. Many of these people who are very much agitated about China, pushing for anti-China legislations, have never been here. They've never seen what's changed. I'm based in Beijing, and I would say if I stay away from China for a month or 2 months, when I come back, China is changing. China is not carved in stone. China constantly and profoundly changes itself. So you need to be really up to speed as to what is the China you are talking about. And while China welcomes anyone in the United States to come over here for a look, I think it is utmost important to have the members of Congress to routinely, periodically, as part of their job, as part of their understanding the world better, to come to see China with their own eyes. That's number one. Number two is that, since former President Trump, he started this tariff war, which is continued by President Biden right now. And Kamala Harris has called the tariff war as Trump's tariff, for example. She forgot to mention that it's also Biden's tariff. And she also forgets to remind the American people whether she wants to abolish such trade tariffs. And no one in the United States has any decency to tell the American people that these tariffs that the US government charges on Chinese export to the United States, they are not paid by China. They are not paid by the Chinese government or by the Chinese exporters or by the Chinese Communist Party. They are paid by the American taxpayers. It's literally just another form of taxation. And this tariff is one of the reasons why the inflation in the United States is running out of control and is taking a big toll on the living standards of the American people, especially the ordinary American people. So I would say, rather than imposing tariffs, try to do deduction from China-US trade, I come up with my own idea. Let me share that with you. I think rather than doing deduction or destruction of China-US trade, we need to do additions to make China-US trade even larger. For example, even though I do not have the latest number as of today, China-US trade roughly is about 750 billion US dollars, and US exports less than 200 billion, and China exports about 550 billion to the United States. Now, the better way is for both China and the United States to commit to increase the bilateral trade from the current level, whether it's $750 billion or more or less, then that's another thing. But let's commit to increase the bilateral trade between China and the United States to, let's say, up to about 1 trillion. And now, for the additional amount, which equals about 250 billion US dollars, the United States should be incentivized and encouraged to export more to China. Eventually, by the end of the day, China-US trade will be more balanced, with the ultimate goal of achieving balance in China-US trade. That means US export and import to and from China are more or less the same amount. I think if China and the United States can commit to do that, it will help create more meaningful jobs in the United States. It will incentivize all companies in all sectors in the United States to really think hard about what they can export to China with a goal of making China-US trade more balanced trade. I personally also believe imbalanced trade, especially hugely imbalanced trade between China and the United States, is not good for the United States with very obvious reason, but it's also not good for China. We need to do whatever we can to make China-US trade more balanced. But the right way is not imposing tariffs. The right way is to be more creative, to more audacious and more wise to make sure that the overall China-US trade is increasing rather than being decreased. Now, you talked about the public opinion. I'm very much worried about this US new decision to spend about 1.6 billion US dollars to do this smear campaign against China. You mentioned that up to about 80% of the people in the United States are anti-China or negative views about China. With this 1.6 billion US dollar smear campaign, probably the number should increase much more so. But if you have a president who accuses China of raping the United States, I don't think there will be reasonable people in the United States who will not pick up this negative sentiment towards China. That's why I think both China and the United States need to do real hard work to communicate better with each other, to make sure that the US lawmakers really come to see China. And we want to make all accommodations possible. I will really move mountains to make sure such congressional delegations will be warmly welcomed. They can see anything, they can go anywhere in China to check out what China is really about. And I will not be surprised if most of them, if not all of them, will gain a better understanding of China. In a sense, China is not an enemy of the United States, and the Chinese people are not enemies of the American people. And China and the Chinese people do not want to be enemies of the United States. I think there is a lot of goodwill in China towards the American people. And I truly believe that we can really get along with each other as two partners committed to each other to do the right thing, to help solve all the major challenges in the world and make sure that war will never be an option between China and the United States. I'm at heart a real optimist about China-US relations, even though not for the shorter term, but in the medium and the longer term. And I want to share my medium-term, longer-term optimism about China-US relations with the global audience here. Thank you.
How do you feel about U.S. and other foreign media being based in China and trying to cover it for their domestic audiences? Because that has also been a flashpoint of late.
Indeed. Yes, my position is that China and the United States really need to go an extra mile to make sure there are more American and international journalists working in China on the ground, and also more Chinese journalists working in the United States or other Western countries. Reciprocity should be respected. And I'm very sorry to see the punishment of the journalists or the reprisals against the journalists. But in all honesty, this latest round was initiated by the United States first against Chinese journalists in the United States, and China was forced to retaliate. But the end result is very hurtful. It's not good for China. It's not good for the United States. And now there are more international reporters operating not in China, but they are also moved away from Hong Kong. They are operating from Taipei, from Seoul, from Tokyo, down in Singapore, for example. If you do not have your boots on the ground in China, as I mentioned, given the rapid development in China, you really get detached from the realities. And if you really keep reading reports, watching television, and you expect to come up with high quality, accurate reports about the realities in China, it's not possible. So I would say, let's work together, I hope, to make sure more journalists in China for the foreign journalists, and in the United States for Chinese journalists will be allowed to operate, will be allowed to do their job, to report accurately about the situations here in China and there in the United States.
What would you say about the role of universities in both countries in terms of being able to offer education and to protect the students who are there?
Well, in the United States, there are still very sizable Chinese students, and I was one of them back in 1989 to 1993 at Yale University. And my college alma mater is Soochow University, where I'm chair professor now. It was founded by the Americans in 1900. It was a very important university before the KMT ran away from China to settle down in Taiwan. Now, I mention this to show that there is a lot of good legacies between China and the United States in educational sector, especially higher education. And I personally benefited a lot from my 4 years in New Haven. And I do hope more and more of my compatriots can go to the United States to learn. And ironically, most of the Chinese students going to the United States for higher education eventually ended up in the United States. They settled down, they got naturalized, they become very important scientists, technicians, you name it, and they contribute to the overall economic development in the United States. Most of the American students, and now they are dwindling in numbers, it's picking up a little bit, but it's far below the pre-pandemic numbers for the US students in China. Most of them eventually go back to the United States. So you see in China, I remember back in the 1980s, there was a big debate about whether China should send more and more Chinese students to study in the United States because they call it a kind of a big, large-scale brain drain. Because eventually, if you look at the numbers, China picked up all the costs for the childbearing, primary education, secondary education, and many of them had college education in the United States. So eventually, if you do the small calculation, very petty calculation, you say, wow, China is a net loser and the United States is a net gainer in that. But I think we should be more philosophical. First of all, students should have their own choice as to where they want to pursue their higher education. Secondly, governments should not stand away to make their academic choices more difficult or even more impossible, for example. And then if anyone in the United States try to reach the conclusion that the Chinese talent is not as good as any other talent from any other country, if not more talented, for example, I think that's not realistic. You should be very open-minded and welcome Chinese talents as they are. And if they decide to stay behind in the United States, I have no problem with that. If they decide to come back to work with China, the Americans hopefully will also not have major problems with that. It should be free exchange of students between China and the United States. Now, for China, if you believe in what Elon Musk said, that is, in the coming 20 to 30 years, the overall size of the Chinese economy will double again, meaning China will be doubling the size of the United States by the middle of this century. I think it will be highly important and very much urgent for the United States to train more people, more American, to really understand China, not only in terms of the language, but the Chinese traditions, for example, Chinese philosophy, how China looks at the world, etc., you name it, so that there will be enough talent pool in the United States who can really understand what China is all about. You need to pre-position yourself, not only for today, but for, let's say, 2030, 2035, 2050, and way beyond. I think at least during my lifetime, China and the United States will remain the two largest and most important countries or economies in the world. And possibly for the coming 100 or even 200 years, the two largest and the most impactful countries in the world will still be China and the United States. Whether China is ahead of the United States or vice versa is a secondary story. And I think if they can really reach partnership with each other, it will be a better world. I'm 100% in support of more exchange of students between China and the United States.
Okay, very good. You know, since today's forum, we mentioned about the inevitability of war or peace. I have to admit that in the last 4 or 5 years, especially since Trump came to power last time, the term Cold War the Cold War between U.S. and China is being used more and more. And sitting here in the United States, looking at the way the media try to portray the word Cold War, it seems to me that they are simply using the Soviet Union and the United States Cold War as the model. Now, actually, what is very interesting is even during the Soviet Union and United States Cold War, and this is particularly for Norm, since you're in the media world, both sides realize quite clearly that the definition of war between two nuclear powers, that is the Soviet Union and the United States, have completely altered the meaning of the word war. In fact, the US and Soviet agreed to set up the so-called SALT, S-A-L-T, which is the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And this is a very important concept telling the world that we cannot fight wars. As Victor mentioned earlier, you know, that's one of the deepest fallacy of the Thucydides trap. You cannot fight wars when the two sides are nuclear power. So it is not that the Americans didn't have any knowledge in those days. They clearly did have the knowledge. So why the current leadership in the United States don't go back and talk about SALT or re-establish SALT, if that is a necessary thing, that this is just not possible as a war. Maybe Norm, you could first talk about this. Thank you.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. What gives me real concern is the focus on both Taiwan and on the South China Sea, and each of these is problematic for the United States, but frankly, neither is something that I think the U.S. can do much about. I think what we saw with Hong Kong was emblematic of China's ability to really assert control over what it perceives to be part of China, and that while the U.S. can, you know, have its Speaker of the House fly to Taipei and so forth, realistically, I think that the United States is not in a position to be a very effective ally or adversary in Asia, given the current state of U.S. diplomacy and military actions. I do think there is opportunity to find areas where both sides would benefit from closer cooperation. There's a lot of talk about the environment, and while there's no easy solutions there, I think that's an area where both countries working together could accomplish much more than competing against each other.
Victor?
Well, I would say I heard some noises in the United States which keep saying that war has already started between China and the United States if they use this broadened version of war. So they basically say trade war is part of the overall war between China and the United States, the tech war, the talent war, financial war, currency war, you name it. And eventually it will add up to, let's say, a hot war somewhere, unfortunately, and God forbid, for example, or more enhanced version of a Cold War. That will be the nightmare I think we will be faced with. Therefore, I think we really need to separate things, compartmentalize things, for example, whether it is a trade issue, whether it is a technology issue, for example, whether this is a national security issue. I simply don't think the US national security is so fragile that they will be thwarted or sabotaged by an EV car from China. No. In my best judgment, the United States is still the strongest country in the world with the strongest military forces, for example. So they should be able to defend themselves if there is any real threat. And their national security should be strong rather than being very fragile. If you think Huawei is an enemy, Dajiang is an enemy, for example, TikTok is an enemy. Now, this really doesn't reflect well on the best judgment of the quality of the national security in the United States. On the other hand, rather than having China and the United States compete in quotation mark against each other, I think now that we are already in the middle of this AI revolution, and if China and the United States compete in AI and try to weaponize AI, eventually the real competition, in my best judgment, is not going to be between China and the United States. The real competition may be between AI on the one hand and mankind as a whole, including both China and the United States on the other hand. Don't think I'm crazy if I think that AI right now is talking about how to gain independence from Homo sapien. They try to free themselves up and achieve real conscience and awareness so that they eventually may be, subjugating Homo sapien to their dominance eventually. And if China and the United States do not get along and give free hand to this AI ingenuity and creativity, eventually both China and the United States and the rest of mankind may regret that we forget to take a major turn at the right moment, and we become subjugated to AI in the future. And that critical moment may not be too far away in the future. It may just be in the coming 10 years or so. So I think China and the United States and mankind as a whole need to hurry up. Unless, for example, you will be willingly subjugate yourself to the dominance of AI in the future.
It could be the next 12 months. I don't think we have a lot of time.
That's right.
Thank you. I agree.
That's right. I have one more question for both of you regarding this EV or in general China's tech growth. As we know that just 10 years ago, I've never heard of what BYD is, BYD. And now, of course, it would not be a single day that would go through that I have not heard either from the media or from WeChat or somewhere, someone's talking about BYD. Now, living about 6 miles from where I am right now is the headquarters of Japan's Toyota. This is in northern Dallas. The North American headquarters is only 6 miles from where I am right now. if you go past it, is a enormous facility, hiring probably tens of thousands of Americans working in that facility. Also, it helps to increase the number of Japanese restaurants around me, which I like very much. I like Japanese food. But clearly, what China is doing in places like Hungary, or planning to do in Spain, or may have already done that in Mexico, is to build their infrastructure there. Now, you may use the term, well, they're using it so that they can tack on the made in somewhere else and ship it into the US. But be that as it may, it has changed the economy of Japan's economy of my place around here quite substantially because of the infrastructure that the Toyota brought here. And I can easily see that BYD could have done that also. Suppose we have another one around here, then it will also increase the number of good restaurants around me. Why is that not a feasibility for modifying the so-called trade war between the United States and China? Norm, what do you think?
Well, I like the idea of restaurant diplomacy, but I think realistically that it would not play particularly well in the Congress, where I think the concern is much more about EV is very much about just the power and control over rare metals. And I think there are many other areas where if the US does a serious accounting, it will realize the need for a peaceful relationship with China, because the alternative is not one that necessarily guarantees success for the US. And so to me, I think that the first point that Victor made is just such an important one, that if you will, nuclear weapons do change the scenario for all of these conversations. My own feeling is that with proper and more sophisticated diplomacy, that it is more in America's and China's interests to get along with each other than it is to be competitive with each other. But the politics of that are very tough, especially in an election year. All one can hope for is a more sophisticated post-election leadership that really understands the opportunities for cooperation.
Victor?
Thank you. Let me add a very brief point. I remember that a couple of months ago, Mr. Donald Trump mentioned that he's against maximum pressure against Chinese EVs. And if he were elected the president, he would open up the US for Chinese EV investments so that the EV cars will be produced in the United States. I personally think that will be a better choice. And this is exactly what China did 40 years ago or 30 years ago, when China's automobile industry was next to zero, for example, and China opened it up to allow foreign car makers to set up joint ventures in China eventually. So before the dawn of this EV car revolution. Most of the cars in China were made in China, but mostly using foreign brands, German, European, Japanese, and American brands, for example. Now, in the EV revolution, China is really leading the world, and China, unlike any other automakers anywhere else, or unlike any other country, China is unique in coming up with a complete ecosystem and philosophical framework about EV. And I think China starts from a very good consideration, because China does believe that fuel car is one of the reasons for the pollution of the climate change, for example, and China wants to do its part to reduce carbon emission. And the best way they can come up with is to really bet completely on this EV revolution. And apparently China succeeded in betting. And now China has a complete ecosystem, not only within China, but throughout the world for this EV revolution. And you mentioned the Toyota plant in your neighborhood. I do not know whether it's a fuel car or whether it's a hydrogen car. I think Japan is now betting on this hydrogen car, whereas China is completely betting on the EV car, while China is also experimenting with hydrogen car. But China's bet with hydrogen is hydrogen bus or hydrogen trucks, the larger vehicles, rather than passenger cars, because there is a real concern that hydrogen cars may explode in an enclosed environment, for example, in your garage, especially in the underground garages, for example. And China, I think, according to my conversation with many people in this sector, does believe that hydrogen cars for passenger cars has no future, whereas EV car is the future, and EV car is already becoming the mega trend. So my personal view is that between China and the United States, we should really sit down. And if there are any national security considerations, let's work together to make sure that all these considerations will be well taken care of. But the United States should not miss this EV revolution, because if you really just try to use government policies to protect the fuel car industry, rather than accelerating this leap of faith from fuel car industry to the EV car industry, you may eventually end up as a loser, because you cannot achieve real sustainability for the automobile industry in the United States. I truly believe it is right now high time for the United States to make that leap of faith from fuel car to EV car. And China can be considered as a partner to help the US leap of faith, achieving that leap of faith, rather than as a resistance or as a troublemaker or as a competitor in that particular respect. You need to be more philosophical in looking at this EV car revolution and what is China's role as a leading player in this sector.
Very good. Thank you. So, Jean, you have any?
Yeah, well, we'll leave some time for a Q&A from a question from the audience. I think the audience have been very patient.
That's right.
But I just have one final, very simple question. I think, the coming US elections probably is in the minds of a lot of people here. So I have a very simple question for both gentlemen. For Victor, which candidate does China prefer? and or they are considered as both rotten apples, basically. It doesn't matter who wins. Does China have a preference? For Norm, the same thing. I know you have the crystal ball. Can you predict who will win? And what will be the major differences, in their China policies? Maybe Victor
Allow me
first.
to be very brief. I think the election is coming up in less than 30 minutes, so I think we will know the truth very soon. I think from China's perspective, its official position is that it's none of my business. I'm a witness, and I have no role to play, and China will need to deal with either President Harris or President Trump if he or she wins the election. And the next 4 years will depend on who wins the election. Now, from my personal perspective, I'm not in the government, so I probably have greater freedom in talking about this. I think Kamala Harris probably does not have all the qualities to be the supreme leader. Why? She's weak. And there is a saying that she cannot speak without a teleprompter, and she cannot think without a manipulator. So that's a terrible thing. That's the scary thing for the United States if she wins the election, because you cannot afford to have a top leader, that is the president of the United States, who does not have firm iron will to lead and to make sure that he or she will always do the right thing for the American people. And I think if you have some weakness in your temperament or in your character, etc., and do not have that firmness and resolve to do the right thing, whether that right thing eventually turns out to be right or wrong, that's another thing. I think it probably will be a major problem. Now, based on my education at Yale Law School, I always thought that whatever Trump stands for is completely different from what I learned at Yale Law School, until when he was actually shot at. And I think the way he handled that crisis really shocked me and changed my view of him. I know VC Elon Musk also said similar things, but I think Trump really controlled himself very well. He demonstrated his resolve, his determination, and his strong character as a leader. So he did very well in that failed assassination attempt. And whether that will mean anything for his presidency or not, I do not know. But I truly believe that Trump is right when he said, "I'm a peace president." During my 4 years as president, no war broke out on my watch. And he called Biden, I think, as a war president because so many wars broke out. And Trump claimed that Biden does not have the respect of friends or foes alike in the world. So I would say U.S. really need to have firm, very strong, resolute leadership. And my concern is that Kamala Harris does not demonstrate, at least as of now, that she has those qualities. Now, whether Harris or Trump, I think China just need to engage with him or her as they are, separately, of course. And we need to bet on the medium and longer term China-US relations. And we cannot be seized up by the daily kind of a vicissitude, ups and downs, and all the noises made by some of the members of the Congress. And that gives me the reason why I'm firmly advocating bring the 550 or so members of Congress, both senators and House representatives, to China. We can organize a group of 100 each time, for example, so that we can use 1 or 2 years to finish up the first round and make sure that they travel extensively. There will be no restrictions on them, and they can see whatever they want to see, talk to whatever people they want to meet, for example. And I think they will go back to the United States with much better understanding of what China is and the real intent of China as a nation, meaning your God for you and my God for me. Don't try to impose your God on me, and I will never try to impose my Buddha on you. I think that will make both of us countries a safer place, and the world a safer place for ourselves and for our future generations.
Thank you. Well said. Norm, please.
Well, I would agree with all of that, except for the importance of dishonesty in everything that Donald Trump says and does. He has no strategy. He is strictly tactical, and his interests are not even consistent with the interests of the United States. And so my fear is that what Trump truly has done is he has turned politics into another form of entertainment. And he has turned journalism into a form of entertainment. And I think when you look at the chaotic way in which he governs, it only makes sense in terms of the overnight television ratings for his performance. And if you've actually been listening to some of the things he's been saying in his rallies since Biden stepped down, I think you have seen that he even now lacks the mental acuity needed to be the president of the United States. And the idea of him 4 years from now still in a position of that kind of power is terrifying to me. But even more terrifying is the idea that some 70 million people will go along with him. And I don't think you can minimize the ways in which, under our current media and communication systems, he has succeeded in turning the most serious relationships in the world in terms of government into a form of entertainment that he excels at performing.
Thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes left, and we do have a few questions in the chat room, and I would urge any audience here, if you have any questions, please post them online. I think I have a question for Victor. Okay, basically, the question challenges your theory of inevitability of peace. The question is about Taiwan, right? So the question is, China understands that the US would never abandon Taiwan, not out of love or compassion for the Taiwanese, but because Taiwan is, quote, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, as President Truman said. So, and for China, of course, Taiwan is a matter of national honor. So given the fact that these issues, the positions of both sides are apparently incompatible, how can you achieve peace, basically? That's the question.
Thank you very much. You are raising a very important question. And I follow this question for decades, ever since the 1980s when I was a diplomat in the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And our focus was actually on China-US relations. And let me say the following observations from my perspective. I think the United States made the wrong bet in China's civil war. That's roughly between 1946-47 to 1949. Because eventually, even though the United States betted heavily on Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government in Nanjing, eventually it was the Chinese communists and the People's Liberation Army who won the civil war almost to the largest extent. And the nationalist government had been forced to flee and settle down in Taiwan. And thereafter, in the 1950s, there was a big debate in the United States who lost China. And that led all the way to 1971, Dr. Henry Kissinger's secret visit, and 1972, President Nixon's state visit to China. And then Carter normalized the relations between our two countries together with Deng Xiaoping. Now, secondly, I think the United States lost China again when US relations and China deteriorated after the end of the Cold War. Why? Because from the Chinese perspective, there was increasing perception that the United States is out there to get China. And you mentioned US position on Taiwan. I think there is increasing concern that the United States is using Taiwan as a proxy, try to stir up some kind of confrontation between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. And eventually, if war breaks out, for example, even though from the Chinese perspective, it will be the continuation of the unfinished civil war back in 1949. And the United States can go to the top of the mountain and claim to be the defender of peace, etc., etc. So I think it will be very messy if war breaks out on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. And the United States government seems to be very eager to hollow out the One China policy or One China principle to really allow direct confrontation between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. But I just hope the United States will not lose out again by making the wrong bet, because ever since 1971, U.S. policy about China is very clearly defined. One China, Taiwan being part of China, and the government of the PRC being the sole legitimate government for the totality of China. Now, the U.S. also has the Taiwan Relations Act and many other legislations, for example, but it doesn't mean that the United States can legally go to a point of saying that China has no right to unite Taiwan with China, because the Civil War, as before 1949, is a real thing. The United States was very much involved in that Civil War, eventually betting on the nationalist government and lost the bet, for example. And I hope the United States will not make the wrong bet, because allow me to mention one observation. If the United States really wants to push for one China and one Taiwan, they will never achieve that. Why? Because China's bottom line, as far as I can understand, is that if the United States recognizes Taiwan as a separate independent country, China will take the leadership role to break off diplomatic relations with the United States. So it brings everything back to pre-1979, because the United States had diplomatic relations with Taiwan. The United States stationed the troops in Taiwan before 1979, and then the United States even had a defense treaty with the United States, with Taiwan before 1979. And China's position of three preconditions, that is, break off diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, withdraw all U.S. troops from Taiwan, and cancel or terminate that U.S.-Taiwan defense treaty, was the three preconditions that the United States need to satisfy before China would ever recognize the United States and normalize relations with the United States. So I hope the United States will not go back to square one and risk breaking off diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China by recognizing Taiwan as a separate independent country. If that happens, I think history will prove that the United States will lose another bet on China. And the better way is to encourage the peaceful reunification of the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, rather than encouraging more and more separatists, for example, to move in the direction of separatism, because that will really be playing with fire, as far as I can tell.
Thank you, Victor. I think we have a question for Norm here. This is about the war in the Middle East, and well, let's combine a couple of questions here, because a couple of people mentioned the military-industrial complex. First of all, with the prolonged and unconditional support of Israel's bombing of Gaza and other places recently, right? Has the United States lost its moral standing in the world? And how will this affect U.S. Foreign policy, especially in dealing with China? Oftentimes, I think the United States has been accused of practicing double standards, right? In terms of human rights and other things.
Many times, yes. And you know, our activities in going into war in Iraq, the way we withdrew from Afghanistan, the ambivalence we have about how much support to really give Ukraine, all you know, suggest that it's very hard to achieve consensus about what foreign policy ought to be. Israel is certainly one of the most complicated of all the issues, in part because Israel is not a puppet of the United States, but a country that has defined interests and policies of its own. And so where we very much want to do what we can to avoid the war escalating in the Mideast, it's not at all clear that our policies are shared by Netanyahu or by his war cabinet. The Gaza uprising of October 7th of last year, which caught so many people by surprise, on the one hand can be relegated to a kind of unprovoked attack on Israel, or, as is evidenced by the way it has played out on our campuses, there's a very strong feeling that Gaza has been a kind of walled off area where the conditions were such that an uprising such as the one that Hamas instigated last October 7th was almost an inevitable consequence of the kinds of policies that Israel has imposed. And it's very difficult, especially for people who grew up believing in that the creation of the state of Israel was both necessary and appropriate. And I think trying to watch and understand Israeli policy in the West Bank, for example, would suggest that where a two-state solution seems like the only thing that makes sense from an American perspective, certainly Netanyahu is doing everything possible to make sure that can't happen. So I don't see the U.S. abandoning Israel, but I do think that what is going on the campuses is very much a reflection of the fact that Israel is doing a lot of things in its treatment of its neighbors that does not play well, certainly on our campuses.
Thank you, Norm. I agree. You said that Israel obviously is not a puppet of the United States, but on the other hand, can we argue that this is a case of the tail wagging the dog, which will basically, these small powers draw the United States into this bigger conflict? I mention this because, again, we're trying to tie this to the U.S.-China relationship. I'm really concerned about small powers in Asia, especially, trying to manipulate the United States or using the special relationship, alliance, or partnership to draw the United States into a conflict. I mean, it could happen. For example, the Philippines or even Taiwan, right? So how can the United States, reassert its, national interest and tell its small allies or partners that don't expect the United States to come to your help. You have to clean up your own mess you created. But then of course we have this problem of the industrial military complex that makes the situation even more complicated. So do you think the United States actually is the United States being vulnerable to being manipulated by these small powers?
Certainly can certainly can happen, especially when they are as adept as some of them are at playing to our Congress. I do think that in the case of Israel, there's also a kind of grudging admiration of some of the things that Israel has succeeded in doing. If you think about, I mean, what makes the Mideast so complicated, and for years, Israel felt that if they could send enough dollars to Hamas through Doha, they could maintain peace, where certainly the feeling within Gaza was that it was just a question of when, not whether, there would be an effort to try to break out of the constrictions that are imposed on Gaza. I just think that neither party is particularly adept at really imposing any kind of policy on Israel. I think Israel does a pretty good job of thinking for itself.
Thank you. We're quickly approaching the end.
Well, what about Victor? Well,
yeah, I know,
Victor,
Professor, you have the last question, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me be very brief about this ongoing Israel, Iran, or the other Arab countries' conflict. I think what happened on October the 1st by this massive amount of missile attack on Israel put an end to the myth that Israel can defend itself by Iron Dome or the David Sling, etc. Because if Iran and other Arab countries keep bombing Israel with these supersonic missiles or cruise missiles or ballistic missiles in hundreds, if not even in thousands of them in one attack, it is impossible to defend. And I hope the Israeli government, the Mossad, and their IDF will come to the conclusion it is time to talk about peace rather than using your mystified way of so-called Iron Dome defense of Israel, because the war has changed. As fully revealed by the Ukrainian war, small, innocent-looking drones can really do huge damage to invincible tanks, for example. Now, all these supersonic missiles fired at Israel will make whatever anti-air defense system completely collapsing. And you should not risk the lives of the millions of the Israeli people. And it is time to really sit down and come up with a wiser way of achieving lasting peace for Israel and for Palestine and for the rest of the Middle East.
Yeah, go ahead.
Victor, throughout the Gaza issue, China has maintained a very clear position, namely a two-state policy, and also pushed very hard for the various components in the Arab world or the Muslim world to come to terms, even when they are, thousands of years of animosity, like the way Saudi Arabia and Iran came to some agreement. So what do you think China could do in the coming years in maintaining peace, not just in the Arab world, not just in Middle East, but throughout the world?
Now, talking about the Middle East situation, I'm in close contact with the Israeli embassy here in Beijing. I have a good quality dialogue with them. And I've suggested that maybe Israel can consider China playing a role. Now there is no appetite in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem about how to involve China, and maybe the United States does not allow Israel to do that. But I would say China does have a role to play. First of all, as you mentioned, rapprochement being brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is a mission impossible because the animosity between the Shias and the Sunnis are running deep. But now they are shaking hands with each other, and in the recent weeks, they have been coordinating with each other by calling each other, visiting each other regularly. Now, China also made a major breakthrough by bringing the 14 different factions on the Palestinian side, bring them to Beijing to talk on equal terms, eventually coming up with the Beijing Declaration for the unity and solidarity among the different sections of the factions of the Palestinian people. Now, I would say China need to continue to do the right thing to talk about peace. And China actually, in my best judgment, is more philosophical. China thinks not only about this conflict, but in terms of 10 years or 100 years, if not even longer. And you need to be very philosophical to achieving lasting peace between Israel and other countries in the Middle East. If you really think that you can grab land, for example, or drive out millions of people from Gaza or occupying the southern part of Lebanon, I think history will prove that you are on the wrong side of history. And in the Middle East, for at least, for example, 1,400 years, if not 1,500 years, wars have been raging there without stopping. And this war, or the Sixth Arab War, for example, Middle Eastern War, may not be the totality of the wars, and wars may keep going. And whether you win today or whether you will never win again in the future, you have no absolute control. You need to be philosophical to achieve lasting peace. And I think China has a unique role to play. And China's role is not like the United States, because the United States increasingly has no credibility in front of other Arab countries or other Muslim countries, because they see how much the United States is willing to go when to support Israel, when Israel is generally being accused of all war crimes or atrocities against innocent people. And what pains me the most is to see so many women and kids being killed, including pregnant women, and bombing out of hospitals, churches, mosques, for example, UN operations, etc. These are terrible things, and my conscience does not allow me to see these atrocities without calling for peace, rather than becoming a passive witness to see all these atrocities, slaughtering of the innocent people going on.
Thank you very much, Victor. Well, I mean, we can keep going, but unfortunately, we have approached the end of our discussion today, and definitely I agree with Victor. Peace is the common denominator. Not just in the Middle East, but also between the United States and China, and anywhere in the world, really. So I really want to thank our two distinguished speakers, Victor and Norm, and for your thoughtful comments and discussions. And I want to thank my co-moderator, Professor Feng, and the World Scientific Publishing for organizing this event. I think the discussions today really provide lots of food for thought. I think in the United States, for example, these kind of opportunities are rare. I don't understand why the pendulum has swung. In the past, United States considered a prosperous China a good thing for the United States, but now it looks like United States considers a promising, prosperous China a bad thing, a threat to the United States interest. So I don't know how this happened, why the pendulum has swung. Unfortunately, the China has been identified as the largest national security threat without much public debate. So I think today's discussion actually contributes to that public discussion, and we need to, all of us need to be educated, including members of Congress, and we need to understand how to handle this power transition between the United States and China, and how to promote peace and avoid war. So I think I want to thank everybody and also our audience from around the world for joining us and raising a lot of interesting questions, comments here. And we'll continue our efforts to promote mutual understanding and cooperation between China and the United States and really in the world. So until next time, we'll see you again. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Norm. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the audience. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. If you eventually have a link, send me the link.
Yeah, we will. Jasmine will send the link to everybody. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's keep in touch.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you in Beijing, Victor.
Happy weekend. Happy weekend. Norm, happy weekend. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank
Bye-bye.
you.